Hello everyone, this is Caillou, and I'm here to talk about Merveaux. If you haven't heard about it, Merveaux is a custom set developed by Madalonian. Um, it's based around sort of the aesthetics of, I would say, European Renaissance and the artistic and I guess you would just say creative development of the time, but in a fantastical context. Um, it's a three-color faction set featuring essentially Tarkir color factions. There is Abzan colored Prepare, which is Prepare is an ability word which says if you've created a token or gained life this turn, then effect. Um, there is Mardu Exploit, which if it's a canon mechanic, but if you don't remember it, it's when it enters the battlefield, you may sacrifice a creature, and then they have effects that when so and so exploits a creature effect. Um, there is Sultai Delirium, another canon ability word. In this case, it's if you have four or more card types in your graveyard, then some sort of effect. Then uh, there is Temur Regale. Regale is a new mechanic, which is if you've put a counter on a permanent or cast a non-creature spell this turn. And then finally, there's just Jeskai artifacts. I would also say that those archetypes are effective or are strongest in that order, with Abzan being the strongest, then Delirium, then Exploit, then Regale, and unfortunately Artifacts is last. We're going to see this as we talk through each of the cards, but that's mainly due to the extreme both flexibility and like inherent strength of lots of the cards and archetypes on the higher end of the spectrum. Um, and just yeah, essentially it's a lot easier to move in between or form side strategies within the top three, which is Abzan, Mardu, and Sultai, whereas Regale and especially Jeskai artifacts are a lot harder to flip between strategies effectively and require you going a lot more all in. So it's a little bit harder to assemble unless you have a clear lane. With that being said, let's start and talk through some of these cards. I'm going to be rating these on a scale of S through F. S is, unless there's another S tier card in this pack, you should first pick it. A is sort of like the tier of really good cards that you'd always be happy to play. B is solidly playable. You want this in your deck. C is sort of like filler. You could say C for chaff. It's not like they're fine, but like you're only picking them if there isn't anything better. D is sort of actively bad, like but like okay, and then F is just you don't want this in your deck in any circumstance. For what it's worth, we might not get any on the lower end of the tier. That's just sort of a general scale, but just explaining it before I get into it. So let's start off. So parts picker, I think this is sort of like an automatic A. Um, it's really hard to argue with 2/1s in limited, and the three or more artifacts clause, it gets a lot easier when it itself is an artifact, so you only really need two other artifacts, which you can actually achieve on turn two with some other cards, which we'll be seeing. So this can potentially just be like a 1-mana 3/2 on curve, leads to some really explosive, aggressive starts. One of the better cards from the artifact archetype. Fine Diner is another A. Just like again, like we're seeing that like aggressively statted cheap creatures are kind of perfect no matter what, and the upside on Fine Diner of being able to force force unfortunate blocks or force your opponent to not block because you can just save it through the second ability. Also creating a food means that it's really good obviously in the prepare decks, but it's just sort of an all-around good curve filler. You really want 2 drops in limited, right? And Fine Diner is probably about as good as you're going to get. Speaking of 2 drops, Gnomish Tinkerer. Gnomish Tinkerer is another one of the cards from the artifacts archetype that is pretty good, but it also requires you to be pretty heavily in the archetype. It is one of the cards, I'd say I'd put it at an A. It's another one of the cards that is going to pull you into that archetype pretty heavily. It is a little bit awkward how I almost wish it was a Young Pyro style thing where it's a 1/1, but then you don't have to pay to make the tokens because it's already a little bit of a hoop. But again, just it gumming up your board is just really good for the artifact stack. Spirit of the Opera, uh, I'd almost put it at a B plus A minus. It's like it's good as like a flash Windrake, but really what you want to be doing with this is setting up loops with some other cards because if you get two copies of this, you have but a slow and sort of expensive but reliable way to just keep looping exploit and sacrifice and death triggers. So, and obviously in a pinch, it's really good to just like save a creature that's been targeted by removal, etc., etc. Um, but yeah, I think that Spirit of the Opera is sort of. I think that it's a card that is currently in drafts overlooked, but also I think is not as powerful as some of the other cards we talked about already. Distracted Apprentice, I would put it a solid B plus. Um, it works in so many archetypes, and cards with Legacy are just good. Like again, the back half on this is basically what I want Gnomish Tinkerer to be, except obviously off curve. But yeah, it comes in, it gives you two bodies, which is great for exploit. It gives you artifacts and rewards you for playing artifacts, which is great for the artifact archetype, obviously. And in prepare, it's making you tokens. Like you really can't go wrong with this card. Worksite Visionary, I think I would put it like a B minus C plus. Like it's drawing you a card, but you really want like you don't pick this unless you already have good buildings, which I think really separates it from some of the other cards where like they're inherently powerful, right? Like obviously you can pick this and gamble on like getting some bomb buildings later on, but in general I'm low on the buildings because again they're really heavily in the artifacts archetype, so it kind of like locks you in there. So I would put a Worksite Visionary at around like a C plus. It's a decent card, but both its cost and the archetype that it's locked into and the draft requirements around it kind of hold it back. Bolstering Chefbot is a solid, I think, A minus. It's hard to say. Just I think it's honestly gets an A minus just because like it's a really strong card. It's just that there's so many strong prepare cards, and you only want you don't want your curve to be too top heavy. But yeah, Bolstering Chefbot is one of the many cards that makes prepare really exciting to get into. Uh, Distracting Charcuterie. Um, you kind of just play this as a flash O-ring. The food mode is nice, but yeah, you're only using it in a pinch if you really need to gain life. You're playing this in any white deck, and honestly, it's probably again it's an A. It's a very first pickable card. Just removal is king and limited, and Distracting Charcuterie just kind of does it better than anything else. Um, Sunset Clock Tower. I kind of put this at I put this at a B minus C. It's very similar reason to Worksite Visionary, where it's like it's kind of strong, and it's like once you're starting to like pump up your creatures repeatedly or make tokens, it's quite good, but it needs a bit of overhead investment. Um, and it's just sort of like a little bit slower. Like it's a good engine. Maybe actually let's put it at B minus, not C plus. But like I think that compared to the engines and other archetypes, buildings needing a little while to get going makes them a little harder to justify, even if they are quite strong once quote unquote online. Encore is hard to give a score to. I would kind of just put it in a question mark category just because like it really heavily depends on your deck. Like if you have a bunch of good ETBs slash you're heavily into the exploit deck and you can stack your triggers, great. Otherwise, might give this a pass. It's really feast or famine in terms of what you're picking. I'd probably give it then I could give it like a C then, where it's kind of a provisional thing where it can spike, but in a general case it's a C. Which you might be like, whoa, dude, that's kind of crazy to say for like a 2-mana Ghost Away, but not being able to use to like protect your creatures and stuff, and also I think that Ghost Aways and stuff are better when there's like dedicated ETB slash flicker archetypes, where here it's not quite the case. Let's move into blue now. Birdsong. Birdsong I think is a solid B plus. Like it's one of those things where like regale is obviously or sorry sort of always kind of hard because unless you're if you're you need to be using the counter part of it. Otherwise, it's really difficult to sequence, especially repeatedly. But hey, again, if you get to keep triggering this, it's a cheap card advantage engine that also gives you card selection. Um, it being an enchantment creature also makes it good in Delirium, especially when you're fine playing it early and then blocking with it to trade off. And also like obviously since it draws and discards, it's still good in those decks if you like have like some sideways way to trigger Regale. So overall, I think Birdsong is pretty good. Um, the reason I don't rate it higher is because you there's enchantment creatures that are solidly better in their base case, and it is expensive to activate the Regale, and until you're activating the Regale, it's kind of just sitting there, and repeatedly activating the Regale is not cheap. Um, so it's not like an A tier card to me, but it's a solid like B plus. Spectral Scribe is an A. I think that cheap evasive creatures or like a cheap evasive 2-drop is just good, and as soon as you hit Delirium, this thing ends games so quickly. Menace flying it isn't exactly unblockable, especially with Topter tokens in the set, but it's pretty damn close. Um, and it's as close to unblockable as you'd want on a 2-drop. And hitting for 3 and unblockable each turn, yeah, just ends game super quickly. Um, and it's obviously just it's fine in almost any blue deck as just like a cheap evasive creature, but obviously it spikes when you put it into Delirium decks. So yeah, I would put this at like an A. Skillful Landscapist is like, I think I would put it at like a C plus. Like, sure, it mills you for Delirium. It's a weird blue mana dork. It has Legacy and allows you to like do a reverse Lantern control thing where you set up the top of your deck, but it's just sort of outclassed by a lot of cards, even commons in its archetype. Um, I think it's almost a little bit of a trap. I don't think that I don't think you want to be picking up Skillful Landscapist over other cards oftentimes, even some of the commons. So I would say that yeah, it's a solid like C tier card. It's fine to include in your deck, but I think that compared to the other uncommons, it's not quite there. Civil Engineer is like an A plus, maybe even like verging on S tier, which is crazy to say, um, but it's not S tier. Let's just put it at like A plus. It's like it's one of the artifacts cards that is just so backbreaking. Being able to freeze a creature every time you get an artifact is insane, especially with some of the engines that give you repeated artifacts so you can keep creatures locked down for forever. Um, and when you're doing this multiple times per turn, it gets out of hand really quickly. I think that Civil Engineer, and I see this card like wheel a lot. I think people are sleeping on Civil Engineer. Um, so yeah, but like it's a really good incentives to go into artifacts. Um, which again, like artifacts is an archetype which I think that Civil Engineer and these sort of things go later because artifacts is such a weird archetype to get into. But I think also more people should just be forcing it because there's going to be people who are trying to like flex draft, and then you can just sort of choose a lane and push your way into it. Um, Next up is Keeper of the Archives, and I think this is my first like solid like S tier card, which is weird to say for a 6-drop, but games in this format, I think, like they're definitely faster decks as well. Don't get me wrong, especially with Exploit and like Green Red Regale, but I think that you can very often like pick up enough ramp or incidental ways to survive until turn 6. And Keeper of the Archives is like a 4/4 flyer that also grabs you back your removal or bomb in and of itself is just great. Like it's sort of the thing where like you pick it because if you ever get to cast it, you are winning the game. And at 6 mana, it isn't so expensive that it's like out of reach. Next up is First Principles, which I'm going to rate it as C, which is going to be kind of controversial, I think, because you're looking at it and you're like, whoa, dude, this is like just remand but better if you have 3 or more artifacts. My thing is, the artifacts deck does not want to be holding up 4 mana for a counterspell, or does not like isn't going to be holding up 4 mana for like interaction on in like the typical case. It's a lot more of a either value-y or aggro deck, and like obviously like bounce something, draw 2 cards is always going to be insane, but I think that it's sort of in a weird spot where it's a really insane card, but it, the archetype is kind of in a place where you're not sure where you're going to be playing this. So maybe not. Let's put it at B minus because it's obviously a very powerful card if you get it to activate it, but I think it's just in a awkward spot for the archetype, and the archetype itself is awkward in the first place. Next up, we have the Flourishing, which is an solid S tier. This is just insane. It's effectively, it draws you to like 2 more bombs effectively because you're grabbing 2 artifacts or enchantments from your top 6, and then you're making a Haymaker creature, all for just like all in 1 card. It's just insane, even if you're not in Delirium, and obviously spikes if you are in Delirium when a bigger part of your deck is just like that good. So yeah, I think Flourishing is one of the easily first pickable cards in the set, and it's not even close. Yeah. Novel Awakening. Honestly, this card, okay, maybe I'm missing something, but this card kind of struck me as like a D. Like, I think that you have to invest so much mana to get it to be effective over time. It's kind of in an awkward spot where it provides no value on its own. Like, you can make itself into a 3/3 each turn, but I think that the mana you have to invest is really deceptive, and I don't know that what it's doing aligns with what the rest of the artifact and enchantment / delirium archetype wants to be doing. It's one of the few uncommons that I just genuinely would almost never pick up. So yeah, I think that's the first D tier here. Gusbrook Library, I think, is a solid, like, I think I would put it at like A minus, because Surveil is good in multiple archetypes. So you're fine with this being a little bit slower because you're immediately like doing Azcanta things with it, and you can relatively easily turn it into from card selection into card advantage. So Gusbrook Library is just like really good. Yeah, let's just put it as a solid A. Its biggest sin is like being a 3 mana thing that doesn't contribute to the board, but it gives you so much filtering that's very excusable. Speaking of filtering, we have Dreamquill, which I think is a B+. In a similar way to Gusbrook Library, it's just a really strong engine to set up your Delirium, giving you a loot every time equipped creature attacks, and then turning into draw once you have Delirium. So I think that it's worse than Gusbrook Library because you constantly have, like, it's the same 3 mana overhead because of the cast and equip cost, but then you don't get to, like, you need to put creatures in harm's way. You can't, like, play slow with the Dreamquill. So I think that's why Gusbrook is like an A minus A, while Dreamquill is just a solid B+. Okay, getting into black, we have Petite Patissiere. I think Petite Patissiere is like the definition of a B tier card. It's like decent. It's like a good 1-drop, but like oftentimes there are better things you want to be playing. It's like not bad. It's just sort of like it's like 1-drops are just hard to justify, and it's like 1-drop with Death Touch, so it trades up. It's gonna allow you to drain opponents out slowly. Making food on ETB is good, but generally your 2-drops are gonna be doing more impactful things. It's just what it ends up on. I'll find myself picking this up in lots of prepare decks, but I think it also comes around to the prepare decks are really, really stacked, and so I often find myself cutting Petite Patissiere because it just doesn't have as much impact as some of the other prepare cards. But yeah. Next up is Blood Artist. solid A, maybe even S if I play with it. But like, we all know how strong Blood Artist is. I think that uh, in limited, when it's a little bit harder to like set up the perfect sequencings for it, um, it's like a little harder to justify, but it's obviously so good in exploit and even prepare when you're making a bunch of tokens. So like, yeah, it's Blood Artist. Everyone knows Blood Artist. Next up is Enraged Essayist. This is a C for me. I know that when Delirium is on, it's giving you like 5/3 words of stats or 2 bodies, but it is just sort of mid. You're usually not going to have like Delirium online by turn 3, and it's it's just like, yeah, it's kind of underwhelming is just how I feel about it. Like, even when Delirium's online, it's like, okay, I get like 2 bodies. Some of the other Delirium payoffs are crazy. Like, you're fine with having it in your deck, but it's one of the uncommons where I'm like really lukewarm on it, especially compared to some of the commons. So Enraged Essayist gets a solid C tier from me. Opera House Headliner is like a B plus, um, maybe even an A. It works really well with the common we're going to be seeing later, where you really want 3-drop and under exploit cards, which really spikes it. And obviously being just like 2 power menace plus it's drawing you some cards. Actually, yeah, let's put this at A. It's one of the really good cards for the exploit deck. Um, you're really fine throwing away like a 1/1 to draw 2 cards. So yeah, Opera House Headliner is just one of the real good staple exploit cards. Witch of Forbidden Treats is an S tier card. It's one of the many S tier cards in Prepare. I mean, it's basically just a Chupacabra if you have Prepare online, uh, except it has like much bigger stats, which you might be like, okay, well, you need setup. But like, the thing is, getting setup is not insanely difficult. Like, you can say that you have to play off curve to get this setup, but then like there are things that just gain ETB on it, or gain life on attacks, or gain life on your upkeep, or gain life when you like, I don't know, do something. Like, there are lots of little ways to like get Prepare online, and which is just so backbreaking. Like, you take your 2 for 1s in limited, and this is just a really good one. So S tier card, first pickable, and just puts you into the archetype. Dour Chorister is a solid A tier. Um, I think that this card is honestly overlooked a little bit, I think, but lifelink tokens are just insane for Prepare. It giving you like essentially 3 disposable bodies for exploit is nothing to scoff at. Um, and then breakout roll, usually the legacy things you don't want to focus too hard on them, but like it's additional value, and breakout roll works insanely well in exploit, um, where you can just always it basically gives you forever exploit fodder as long as you're casting a single exploit spell per turn. So Dour Chorister is just really good. I think the biggest thing that hurts it is the fact that it's at 5 mana, which is a little bit awkward for where exploit usually wants to be playing, but I think that's totally fine for as much of a bomb as it is, and just how limited works. Like, I think that 5 is sort of like the upper thing of like, okay, unless I'm like in hard aggro, I'm probably going to be able to cast this at some point during a regular limited game. Next up, we have Dishearten, which is a S tier, maybe even S plus. Like, losing 4 life obviously sucks, and there are a non-trivial number of artifact and enchantment creatures that are bombs, but also like, it's 2 mana, just kill a thing, no questions asked, at instant speed. You're gonna take that every day of the week. This goes in every black deck. It's one of the few cards that just goes in literally every deck. So yeah, Dishearten, pick it, put it in every black deck. Thank me later. Criticize is, honestly, I put it at like a C, maybe even D. No, it's a C. It's like you're fine with hand attack and limited, but it's like, especially to grab bombs and stuff. But I don't think it's like that great. And obviously the Delirium gives it a bit more oomph, but like you don't want to be casting hand attack late in the game anyways when you're likely to have Delirium on. And the Delirium is like kind of minor. Like it's fine, but it's not enough to elevate this card from just sort of being okay hand attack. So yeah, this is like again one of the uncommons that I don't really think is pickable over the commons usually. So I'm going to give it like maybe a C minus. Second showing is another card that I think is a question mark because it, like Encore before, it really depends on how many good ETBs you have in your deck. I'd put it like a C plus. I think that again, Reanimation and Limited is a little weird because of just how the targets line up and how consistently you're able to do it. So you really want to be using the double ETB for this to be worth it. So yeah, I haven't really found a deck that I want this in, but I know that they exist, so I'm going to give it the C plus out of like a benefit of doubt type deal. Discouraging Flop is an S plus, one of the best cards in the set. It's been nerfed, but it's still insane. It gives you a one-sided wipe. It gives you a bunch of life gain to stabilize. It's backbreaking against certain decks and just insanely good versus others. Like, again, if you see this in a pack and you don't first pick it, you're making a mistake. Straight up. Cards broken. Next up, we have red. So, Reptilian Rhymester. Pretty good. It's weird. It's like you actually don't want to be using the second part, like its non-prowess ability most of the time, because you want your counters to be placed as slowly as possible so that you have regale over time. So really he's just a 1/1 prowesser, which again is eminently fine because you're gonna just bonk people in aggro decks, but you should just be evaluating this as a 1/1 prowess, in which case it's a solid B tier. Maybe even B plus actually. Just like aggressive 1-drops are really good in the right deck. So I think B plus makes a lot of sense. You're not really first picking this unless you're already heavily committed to aggro, but it's really, really good for encouraging that. Stunning Soprano is an A tier card. Again, we were talking earlier, you really want good exploit cards that are CMC 3 or less. This is one of those. It's removal or face burn. You don't, again, at worst, it's like you sack itself and it's just like a 2-mana shock. At best, you have fodder and it's a 2/2 that comes with a kill one of your opponent's things. So, really just one of the better cards to be seeing early on in a pack. Merrymaker, I would put at a B plus. Again, Regale is a little awkward to trigger, but 1 red mana is a really easy cost to have on top of something, and like making a bunch of creatures with prowess is insane. Making a bunch of tokens is great for exploit too. Merrymaker might actually make it to my A tier. It recently had some numbers moved around, so I might be evaluating it based on its previous effectiveness, but for now I think it's a solid somewhere between B plus and A, and I have to think about it more. Basically it's good and you should be picking it if you see it. Impassioned Storyteller is, I think, like a B tier for me. Like obviously being able to force good blocks and having a Saga from Grave is quite good. I just think that actually let's put it at B plus. Like there's enough value going on here that it's worth it. I just think that like it ends up in a weird spot relative to, okay, what am I cutting for this when you're doing deck building? It's a good card, but one that I think, yeah, it ends up in weird spots in decks in this format. Still, it's just good value, so I would put it at a B plus. Waxcrafter is an A, which might be, or actually no, let's put it at B plus. Let's not get too hasty. It's good because You just sort of want multiple bodies for exploit, and a 4/4 worth of stats over 3 bodies is just good. Um, I don't think you really usually care about the ramp. It's good for big regale turns though, so um, but yeah, I think that Waxcrafter is a solid thing that doesn't quite put you into exploit itself, but is really good if you're anywhere close to it. Next up, we have Dragon Song. So, Dragon Song is, I think, like a solid B tier, which is weird to say because it's like looking at it, you're like, dude, this is Shivan Dragon, and it is Shivan Dragon, but I again, Regale is non-trivial, um, and I think that in a weird way, lots of the Regale decks play a lot faster than this. Like lots of the Regale decks kind of want to be maxing at 4 and play a bunch of cheap spells to trigger Regale, and they don't want to be investing in like big top end. Still, Dragon Song is just a solid card. Like, actually, let's put it at B plus again. I know I'm doing a lot of B pluses, but I think I really want to say like this is an actively good card to put in your deck because 4/4 flyers are that in limited. So let's put it at that. Rejection of the Monarchy is, I would put it at an S tier card, which might be crazy to some people, but it's a removal spell that functions as face burn, that also draws you a card and ramps you and has big regaled synergies. Like it's good in any red deck and it spikes in some. So it's it's hard to really deny this card. Like I can't name a single red deck that wouldn't want to play Rejection of the Monarchy. And I think it's honestly one of the contributors. Like you'll see that the sagas that we talk about are generally S tiers, and that's one of the reasons that why Regale is sort of hard to get into, because everyone in their colors wants to be picking up the sagas anyways, and sagas are the best way to be triggering Regale because they're manaless past, like they're manaless past the first turn that you play them, so you can really get good Regale sequencings. Next up, we have Sparks of Invention. This was just changed. Now it can hit any number of targets. Um, I think that this is probably still like a, a B tier card just because of how Artifacts is hard to get into, but its ability to function as a 2-for-1 uh, is pretty non negligible. So I'd have to keep an eye on it. But for now, I'm still wary of how good it is in the Artifacts deck, or sorry, how good it is in general because of how hard it is to be flexible in the Artifact deck. It's obviously very good in the Artifacts deck. Um, Next up is Heartblaze Theater. I'm pretty low on this. I think I have this at a C. Obviously, like repeatable cheap antheming is fine, but like of the like you're if you're playing this is because you're pretty heavily in Regale and want cheap Regale triggers, but it's sort of like even compared to the other buildings, it's not giving you much. Um, Audition is another card that's sort of a question mark. In the sense of if you're in exploit, this is like an A tier card. It's insane. If you're not an exploit, you really need to be in cheap regale for it to matter. Otherwise, it's just sort of eh. So probably like a B minus, but then it spikes to like A plus in certain decks. So it doesn't put you into an archetype, but it's very good in multiple archetypes. Kitty Connoisseur, I think, is sort of in the same place as Petite Pâtissière, except it's a little bit better because it presents actual stats. Now, that might sound weird because you're like, wait, Petite Pâtissière makes a food. So isn't that like self-enabling for the archetype better? I think that oftentimes you're going to have like a decent number of enablers. What you really want is good ways to close out the game in Prepare. And I think that Kitty Connoisseur offers that. I think that in if it was any other archetype, it would be a B, but because prepare is just sort of really good, and having a bunch of prepare cards is kind of busted, I put this at a B plus. I think that it's one of the first prepare uncommons I would cut usually, but still very good because you can just grow it to like a 4/4 for one, and you're like, okay, I'm so ahead of curve. Next up, we have Stewster. Um, this is a weird one. It's good because it's a 2-drop, but I like the 2 cost is pretty steep, but I mean it's an engine upon engine, so I think I'd probably give it like a low A, let's say A minus, just because it provides you a lot of value on a bear, well not bear, but sorry, on a 2-drop, which you already want in limited, but the mana cost is a real hoop there. Benevolent Florist. Um, this is an A tier card, one of the stronger cards for prepare. I mean, just effectively doubling every token creation you do is just insane. It being a 4/3 for 3 when you have enough tokens is sort of just desserts. You're just playing this to make all of your token creations that much bigger. Wolfsong is like it's like a B tier card. It's hard to say, right? Because like again, I feel like this is sort of a victim of regale sequencing, where this card is incredibly nutso if you're playing it with a saga, where like you play this turn 4, play like rejection of the monarchy plus this turn 5, plus activate this turn 5, swing for a bunch, and then turn 6 you land drop, activate this 3 times and just alpha strike your opponent. But again, it's with regale you really need things to line up perfectly in a way that you don't quite need in other archetypes. Um, so actually, I'll put this at a B plus. It's as a 3/3 trample with potential upside. It's still a decent curve filler. An enchantment creature is good for delirium, but yeah, I think that it's another victim. Oh wait, and it's actually activate only once each turn. Well, I guess it's less quote unquote broken than on the top end case, but still harder to justify with regale sequencing. Yeah, I don't know how to feel about it. I'm gonna put it back to a B. Skilled sous chef is like B plus A minus. Like, okay, it's a card draw engine for prepare, but again, you don't want too much top end for prepare, and you'd prefer something that closes out the game. It's like sort of straightforwardly face value good, but again, there are lots of top tier prepare cards, and so skilled sous chef is sort of like in that spot where you can prioritize other top tier cards over her potentially. Atelier Exemplar is an S tier card. It's another card. It's weird because I think that this is sort of in a similar vein to uh, the Sphinx from earlier, where it's like 6 mana is a lot, but you play this, and if you're playing this even in a non-delirium deck, you're probably incidentally going to hit delirium just because of how decks in this format work by the time you play this. And then it's a 7/7 vigilance trample, and if your opponent doesn't instantly have removal, they're just dead. It just takes over the game on its own. So yeah, um, not much to say there. It's just a stat monster. Founding of the City is like a solid B tier card where it's really good in regale and it can potentially ramp you, but I also think that it's a trap that people pick up earlier than they should. You'd really want this in like green red regale because it it doesn't do as much as it looks like. You really want to be in green red regale aggro, in which case this is like an S plus tier card. But if you're not in green red regale aggro, you really need to be considering your curve and have a lot of 3 drops that you're so that you can mana cheat with this the turn you play it. Artist Easel is like a B minus. It's fine, but like obviously like as a you really want Delirium on this so that it can be a true regrowth, but obviously it being an artifact and being able to put itself in your graveyard to enable Delirium and it's self-milling, both are like fine knobs. I just think that like actually I'll put this at a B. B plus. It's a good card. It's just a little hard to sequence into Delirium decks. Like, and by not sequencing is usually referring to playing stuff on curve. I mean more like um, it's hard to figure out where to fit it in Delirium decks. Um, Tend the Garden is I think Tend the Garden is like B minus. It's maybe even a C. No, it's a B minus. Like it gets you a bunch of mana in your tokens decks, but really what you want, especially at the 3-drop slot, is good curve fillers and stuff that and like you want to start getting into either engines or things that put big bodies on the board. So I think Tend the Garden is sort of even in the decks that you would typically want it in, not as baller as it doesn't pop off as hard as it would seem to. Cost of Perfection is a D tier card, which I know that one thing to remember about this format, obviously, is that artifact enchantment removal is main deckable, but I think that even for instant speed, 2 mana, the fact that it can miss some stuff as a quote unquote sideboard card is huge. I don't think the Surveil makes up for that. I think that you honestly want to be running some of the commons that do point and click artifact removal, uh, artifact enchantment removal, uh, to hit everything basically. So yeah, I think that Cost of Perfection is sort of not in a spot where you want to be picking it up over most cards at the current time. Okay, next up we're going to be getting into multicolored cards. These are obviously sort of the big draws. Castleway Crane is the building that I think is most attractive. I would put it at a solid A, where it lets you do a lot of crazy stuff with your buildings, and obviously once it becomes a draw engine, it's just off the wall. And because of how it works, where it lets you just put a, because usually the buildings, actually, am I thinking of this right? Let me look at the other buildings and make sure that I'm, yeah, because they say put a brick counter on this. This lets you put a brick counter on any building you control. So it has additional utility even after you like max out on it, because it lets you max out your other buildings. Again, the only reason that this isn't absolutely insane is because Artifacts is sort of a weak archetype, or like not a weak, sorry, inflexible archetype. But otherwise, this is a strong A tier card and one of the big reasons to go into Artifacts. Forlorn Author is like a B tier. You don't pick up this card unless you're already in Delirium, is my read on it. Like, it's fine, but you really aren't playing it out unless you have hard Delirium, and it doesn't really draw you into Delirium itself as like a slow potential card draw engine. Soliloquist is an S tier card. It's one of the best 2-drops in the format. It is just so hard to overstate how good this card is as a scaling menace 2-drop. I think that this is the number one card that's going to pull you into Exploit. It's a number one card that honestly bridges between Prepare and Exploit, where you can get into the Jund Sacrifice archetype, which is sort of a sideways strategy. But yeah, Soliloquist is just insanely good. Pick it up like, yeah, it is one of the best cards to pick in the format. Flame Thumper is like B tier, maybe even lower. It's like a 3/3 trample haste for 4 is not bad, and obviously when you're regaling, it's a free 5/5 for 4 with trample, which is quite good. I just think that Regale is sort of in a weird spot, and I maybe let's give it a B plus. But yeah, I think that Flame Thumper is not as good as compared to uh, some of its other peers over here. Secret Ingredients is A plus. Like, sure, it's an anthem only for your tokens, but I mean, okay, you're giving them the vigilance as well, so your opponent can't profitably attack back. You can uh, pump them even harder and give them trample by sacrificing food. It's kind of just insane. Like, obviously, you want this in a deck with a lot of tokens, but that's sort of trivial. Um, so yeah, A tier card. Dancing Troupe. I mean, it's a panharmonicon. The I mentioned before how you really want to make sure that you have like for some of the other flicker cards, you want good ETBs. I think a similar thing for Dancing Troupe, but Dancing Troupe just doubling all of your ETBs rather than sort of being a single use thing. It's more of an engine, and I think it's a lot more justifiable to pick this early. I put this at like an A minus. I've gone down in this card as I've played more of the format, but I still think that like it's it's still really good. Wandering Connoisseur. This is an S tier card. It's one of the cards that's going to pull you into prepare. I know that might sound crazy when I was just like, Flame Thumper is just a 3/3 trample haste that can maybe be a 5/5. What changes it for me for Wandering Connoisseur is that Menace and Trample is a lot more annoying to deal with in terms of blocking. It starts out as a 4/3, and if it's once it starts growing, it quickly outstrips Flame Thumper in terms of stats, and just scales like any sort of scaling means that you can outsize whatever your opponent is doing. And I think that Wandering Connoisseur has enough starting stats that like the scaling is just desserts. It's gone through a few iterations, but yeah, it's still really good. Hunt for Inspiration is a solid A tier. Like the you obviously really want Delirium for this, but I think like I was talking about this earlier, where like in this format, by the time you hit turn 6, you can even in non-Delirium focused decks kind of naturally hit Delirium off if you just play a little bit towards that. Um, yeah, I think Hunt for Inspiration is just pretty decent as for giving you put like 6 power in the air plus like buffing up the rest of your team. Um, Valiant Violinist is like a B tier, and I think that's more to do with Regale than its inherent power. Like, obviously in Regale, like, whoa, you it's essentially unblockable 2 damage plus like you get to do some more card selection to potentially keep activating your Regale. That's pretty great, but it's again like Regale in general, especially with things that have activated abilities, are just so much clunkier to sequence than uh, some of the other archetypes. So that's just how it ends up. Silverstone Forge. Um, I think that this is like a B plus A minus type deal. Um, being like an impact tremors for your artifacts is pretty darn good, especially since it provides its own fodder. Um, Unfortunately, it sacrifices its own fodder, but maybe this is more of a B plus actually. It's just it it needing 2 build counters to really start doing anything or like start fueling itself is kind of whack, and it not generating you lasting advantages outside of life advantages is a little hard. Um, Meticulous Sculptor is a solid A tier. I think that this is a weird card where it's like it's really good with it's like one of the best cards to get with some of these other flicker synergies because of how the sculptor scales. It's one of the cards I think creates a sideways strat on its own where it's like you go into like this weird like Esper flicker thanks to it because it's better with flicker than it is with in the artifact decks usually. Like it's not bad, but usually you really want to abuse the ETB on your meticulous sculptors. So it's an A tier card, but you have to be aware of what you're getting into when picking it. I think because I think like it's still really good in artifact decks, right? You get this uh, essentially 3/3 for 3 stats. I can scale up into maybe even like 8/8 over 2 bodies or whatever, but it's a little bit. It's not like the optimal thing to be doing with it. I think Wicked Wordsmith I think is sort of like B tier, maybe even B minus. Like sure it helps fuel your delirium. Sure it's a 4/4 menace for 3 when you do hit delirium. I just think that it's really underwhelming in both fueling delirium and until you have delirium it's just a 2/4 for 3. It's it's not as face value powerful as some of the other cards here and I think that really hurts it. So like maybe even B minus. Bombastic Performance is an A tier card. Again, I think that just its ability to keep giving you fuel for your exploit, and obviously it doesn't loop itself because it says non-token, but its ability to turn, and since it's not a once each turn as a result, so you can really just go off with this. It also doesn't specifically say sacrifice, so it makes trading so much better in your favor. It's just Bombastic Performance is just like a true engine and one of the best engines for exploit and the potential Jund sacrifice deck. So yeah, this is an A tier card solidly. Opening Act is another A tier card, getting a bunch of like it gives you like sagas are just good in general. This gives you 2/2s, um, and it also sorry it gives you 2 creatures and then it also like pumps everything up and gives it evasion and like giving you 2 creatures with prowess as well is kind of insane. Like this is one of the cards that I think is will put you into regale on its own, which is kind of hard. Um, hard for most cards to do, and it gives you uh, like green red regale aggro is one of the best I think Punisher strats in the format, and this is the card to put you into it. Um, Turnip Trimmer is an S tier card. Uh, its ability to build you a board and trigger prepare by only attacking is and requiring no mana investment is worth so much. It's also the best enabler for one of the best cards in the format, which we're going to be talking about later. Um, but yeah, it's just an S tier card. Like I will pick this up every time I see it. Profane Performer is an A tier card. I mean, it's just it's essentially giving you a bone shards on a creature ETB, um, which again, there's ways to exploit. I mean, literally, but there's ways to reuse your ETBs, and also, like I mentioned, you want 3 drops or lower exploit creatures pretty heavily. It's a little interesting because you usually don't want this in straight exploit decks because the life gain that your opponent gets is, or maybe not want, but it's a little bit harder to justify in straight exploit decks because the life gain it gives your opponent is non-trivial. So it honestly, I think, performs better in prepare decks, but it's still quite good. Free range foraging is an S tier card. Like, oh, okay, you're telling me the base case is I get a 3/2 for 2 that gains me 2 life. So it triggers all your prepare stuff. If you've already gained life, it's a 4/3 for 2. Um, like, okay, I don't like. What else do you need here? It's just kind of messed up. Um, yeah, this is one of the cards that will put you into prepare and put you into it solidly. Grow from Instruction is an A tier card. Um, it gives you I mean it ramps you into some of your really expensive delirium threats. Um, it's an enchantment and it can put itself into the graveyard and also fill up your graveyard and give you card advantage. Um, it's just pretty decent. Like it's weird because it doesn't do anything on board and it's pretty expensive, but I think that it just has like it is one of the cards that really puts you over the top in value matchups and lets you get to your end game faster than opponents. So it's much worth it in my opinion. The Grand Festival is a B tier card. I think it is, as a cheap saga, it's really good in Regale, and I think it's fine elsewhere, but you don't really excessively want it. It's just sort of, especially because like the ramp it gives you is decent, but I think it's more there for like helping you sequence Regale turns. Like you really want to be in Regale for it to work out. Gemcrafter is an A tier card. Um, like its ability to just anthem all of your creatures is really good, especially when you have a bunch of artifact tokens. So like getting three or more artifacts can be pretty easy, and it gives you one on its own. So it basically just says, do you have two or more other artifacts? Which again, we're going to be seeing some cards that can give you two or more other artifacts on turn two on its own. So, and then next up, we're moving into the three color cards. These are the archetype uncommons for each of their like archetypes. Yeah, I don't know why that took me so long to say. Um, Cruel Animancer is actually a B tier card. Um, Obviously, you're like, oh man, it makes it makes 7/4 worth of stats over three bodies. Isn't that insane? Well, you have to sacrifice a creature, so it's only actually going. It's not going up by that creature's power, and with exploit, you really want to be getting something more than just like, oh wow, more exploit fodder. I think that this card is sort of in an awkward spot. Like it used to be at 5 mana where it was really bad. I think at 4 mana it's a lot more justifiable, but I think that like it's almost in a spot where you pick every other exploit card, not exploit card, but like every other exploit uncommon and some of the commons before it, which I don't know is a great place for the three color for the Archon to be. It's still quite good. It's a B tier card. Like it's not unplayable, but you really want your three color cards to be bombs, and I'm not sure that Cruel Animancer gets there. Partners in Rhyme is a solid A tier card. Um, Maybe like let's put it at A plus. It's a 2-for-1 that also like has haste, so it puts immediate pressure on your opponent. Um, you can use this to like using this to get back like the saga that deals 3 damage to any target is sort of the dream, or just any sort of cheap removal. Um, but yeah, ideally you're picking up your cheap sagas, and remember both of the multicolored sagas are 3 mana or less, so work quite well with Partners in Rhyme. I don't know that this is one of like obviously since I put it at A tier, it's pretty first pickable, but I really think that this is one of those cards where you really want to make sure that you're in the deck that wants to be running it before gambling on it, unless there's not anything more flexible in the pack. Angel Iteration is an S tier card. It is just a straight 2-for-1, and being able to destroy non-land permanents and not just creatures is really good in this format, as we've seen. Just really flexible. And again, like we mentioned, by the time you get to these later turns, you are likely to have Delirium turned on anyways, so it's pretty justifiable as a splash in a lot of other decks. Stainghast Sentinel is, I think it's like an A tier for me, but it's kind of hard to say. I almost put it an A minus, and that's again just because like artifacts is such a committal archetype already, and you don't want to be, and like picking up a 3-color card, like it's weird because I guess if you want to commit really hard to it, that cuts artifacts quite well. But also you're sort of double committing by picking up the 3-color card for that archetype and going into archetype that's hard to move out of. But I mean, obviously on its own, it's a scaling, hard to remove flying threat that also generates you card selection. Hard to say no to that. Tea Time 2 gets an S from me. It is the card that'll put you into prepare. It's been nerfed a few times, and I think it's still deceptively very strong. Turnip Trimmer turns it on by itself, but there are a few other ways to do so. We're going to be seeing them at common. And if you get like even one trigger off of this, it's like, oh, okay, it's a 2-for-1. If you start generating if you generate more than one trigger off of this, you're winning the game straight up. But yeah, like this is a card where you build your entire deck around it just because it can solo win you the game. Next up, we're going to be looking at colorless cards. Trash Eater Gnome is basically a sideboard card for Delirium, but since it's a 2-drop creature, you don't mind it that much. Like, yeah, it's hard to give it a rating because it's a sideboard card, I think. But yeah, Constructed Whelp is pretty good. Obviously, like, it's a scaling artifact that also is pretty fine in your exploit decks, and it being colorless means that you're fine splashing it there. And put it in a B tier. Like, it's obviously underrated for its cost because it's colorless, but it's entirely fine to run. Stonework Behemoth is actually like an A tier. Like that, like if you can get this down to like you can get this down to like 4 mana on curve, and just like windmill slam it as like a 6/6 for 4 on turn 4 with ward 3 on turn 4. Really backbreaking. This is one of the big like I am going to mess you up payoffs for stacking a bunch of artifacts and enchantments. So yeah, solid A tier. Ink Bottle is like a B minus C tier. Like Manoliths are fine depending on your deck, and the alt mode here is like good for Delirium. I still think that it's a card that I think is honestly overpicked. It's not that I don't think that like it's not that much better than a Manolith. I'd put it at a C tier. Book and Quill is not that good unless you're in Regale. So I put like a question mark next to it, because if you're in Regale, it's insane because it's free Regale every single turn, and it's unlike a Saga, it doesn't go away after a little bit. If you're not in Regale, it's pretty pants. is what it comes down to. Lands are all good. Play them. Okay, let's move on to the comments. I'm going to be going a little bit quick through these because we just hit an hour. And I do want this to still be a watchable length, and there are more commons than there are uncommons. So I meant to say this up top, but if you want me to elaborate on any of my opinions on any of these cards, or if you have a contrasting opinion, feel free to leave a comment or add me on Discord. But this is just my current impression of these cards. Enraptured Watcher is... and also, I think I'm going to forgo giving these scores unless I think it's really important, just to like speed this up a little bit and just give my commentary. Again, if you want a specific score for a card, for a common, ask me in the comments. Enraptured Watcher is specifically good in exploit, kind of okay in prepare, but generally this is just one of the best cards to enable exploit, but not much else. Congregation Aspirant is really good as a 2-drop that also it like on its own it gives you a scry 1, and then it becomes just like this crazy scry engine. I think that Congregation Aspirant is honestly underpicked, and that's because Artifacts is an underrated archetype, but honestly this works fine even in prepare when you're just making a bunch of like food tokens or whatever. So Congregation Aspirant is one of the better 2-drops at common. Keep an eye on it. Rush Production is, right after I said I wasn't going to give scores, I think Rush Production is honestly an A tier common. It's pickable. It's first pickable over lots of uncommons because giving you 2 artifacts on curve is insane. And if you are, it gives you 2 bodies for exploit. It's a cheap way of giving you tokens for prepare. It gives you a bunch of cheap artifacts for all the 3 or more artifacts things, which again, all of a sudden, if you have a Rush Production on 2, those become so much more achievable. And if this isn't just an artifact raise the alarm, if you're also giving them haste, well, that's just desserts. So Rush Production is, I think, one of the best commons, and you should almost always pick it up unless there's uncommon still in the pack. Diligent Architect is like, I think that the brick counter on target building is like so specific. it's a curve filler, but like again, you want to just be like trying to naturally support your buildings and then just have artifacts and non-creature spells to do them. You don't want to have this roundabout thing. So like a diligent architect is like a C minus D tier for me. Keen Guard Dog is just solidly fine. Like it exists. I think that the legacy is pretty decent. Um, I think that it's like a solid like B minus or something. Like it's not exciting, but like it will fill your curve. I think that's a good thing. Soup Elemental is really good in prepare. It gives you 2 bodies for exploit. There's not a lot more you can ask for. Skystone Gargoyle is pretty decent as a flying card, as a flying 2/3 that also recurs a potential bomb. I think that it's like it doesn't have crazy stats for its cost, but I think it's quite good. And again, it's not. I think people shy away from it because they think, oh, I need to be in full artifacts. You can just have like some good artifacts, like lots of decks in this format naturally will, and then it's just a neat 2-for-1. Inspirational Performer is pretty decent. This is kind of a card that just goes in almost every white deck. It is my curve filler of choice if I need 4 drops. Not much else to say about it. Skystone Seraph is pretty fine. Like a 3-power flyer for 5 that also potentially digs you and gains you life is not bad. I think it's honestly overhyped by lots of drafters. Um, and I think that's especially so since Artifacts is not that great and it doesn't really like outside of Artifacts it's just sort of meh. But yeah, I think that this is a card that I think is overhyped by lots of people and shouldn't be picked as much as it is. Colossal Puppetry is a card that I think is an awkward spot because they're just like it's 4/5 vigilance for 6 that also gets you back another creature. Pretty good, especially because you can just use it to like loop a creature's ETB. But exploit decks really don't want to be going all the way to 6 mana. I think this is a case of a card where it's good in theory, but I don't know that there are a lot of decks that want this slash are make their game plan better by including it. Forge Spray is fine. It's like common removal. Not much else to say about it. Moonridge Tailors is weird. Like the fact that the base mode taps target permanent means that there are cases where I don't know why the base case taps permanence and lets it be like this weird overcosted Rishadan port that immediately goes away at higher build cost. Like it's almost too quote unquote clever for common that like it gets cheaper but becomes more specific as the counters go up because you really I think Moonridge Tailor sort of has the normal problems of buildings, but then it has some weirdness on top of it. But hey, it is a 1-drop building, so. But yeah, I think that Moonridge Tailor is not very good. Deride, well, it's just point and click removal. You're going to be playing this in almost every limited deck. Why not? Lunch Rush is solid combat trick. If you're in the market, you can't really get much better than this. You're probably going to have the 2 or more tokens thing online in every deck that you play this. And then, I mean, in that case, it's just +2/+2 and first strike for 1. Pretty good. Cog Wrench is good, but I think a little underrated again because the artifacts decks are hard to find. I also think that the artifact decks benefit from going wide in a way that I'm not sure that Cog Wrench quite delivers on. But again, for the aggressive artifact decks, it's pretty good. Greenhouse Harvest is like, I see this in way too many prepare decks, but like you should have something better to play in prepare. Prepare is just so stacked. Like Greenhouse Harvest is a fine filler, but like in 9 prepare decks out of 10, you should have something better. Rebuild from scratch. It's artifact and enchantment removal. Pick up at least 1 for your sideboard. That's about it. Mechanical Strix It's a one drop artifact, so if you're an artifacts, which I don't know why you would be this early, it's pretty okay. Um, but it's not really that worth it. It's pretty weak, especially since one drops in limited really need to justify themselves. Prolific Novelist is really, really good. Like two drops in limited obviously need to pull their weight. This loots on ETB as a 2-1 for 2. And then also, so really good in Delirium, but just good in like any blue deck. And then also gets to do it again from the grave because of Legacy. Like you're getting so much value off of this. One of the best two drops right here. Tragic Soloist. Yeah, it exists. I think it's a little bit hamstrung by Regale not being as good, and also Regale being best in green red and in a more aggressive strategy. I find myself picking this up a lot of times because it goes late, and it's just sort of like if I need two drops, I will play this as a 2 mana 1/3. But yeah, Slinking Scribbler, pretty good. Obviously, like uh, I think these sort of cards need more support than they look at first. But obviously, this giving itself Death Touch is pretty neat um, as a way to enable you drawing cards off of it. It's just a decent curve filler. Atelier Artisan is a good way to fill your graveyard for Delirium. Not much more than that. Uh, I think that you play it in basically every Delirium deck ever, especially because those things don't have that many 4 drops they want to play. But otherwise, no, it's not much reason to be running it. Fanciful Flyer is horrendously underpicked. Like I know, like again, I mentioned Regale is not on the menu as much, um, but like 3 power flyers win games. 4 power flyers really win games quickly, and if you can consistently like just have a bunch of cheap spells to play with this, then yeah, I think more blue decks should just be incidentally playing Fanciful Flyer. Bookworm is pretty good, like I just mentioned. 4 power or 3 power flyers win games, and Vigilance on a 4 butt body. This does a great job of like allowing you to win races faster than your opponent does. So I think Bookworm is another card that is sort of underpicked because it's not splashy or flashy, but it really does a good job of winning you games of limited. Storybook Serpent is, I think, almost overpicked. Like, if you can land it, obviously it's good, but you're rarely getting to 7 mana, and as like a 3 mana cycle it's not even that good in Delirium decks. I think that Storybook Serpent is actually pretty bad, and you can really do better than it in lots of decks. Foundry Assistant is like meh. Like again, I think that white red is the best combination for artifacts, and even if you're in blue, you want to be doing something a little more value-y than having this like weird like okay, it's a 3/4, but then I can actually attack now kind of thing. It's like not bad, but it's just a little bit. Defenders are always not that great, and so Prevent Catastrophe. I don't think you. The interesting thing is, I think that you have better things to play this in Delirium decks, but this is, and I don't know that there's like a proper control deck, which is also, I think that Annul is like fine as blue's answers to artifacts and enchantments, but I think Annul is like another one of those cards which is like it's going to go late and you're going to pick one to put in your sideboard, but yeah. Prevent Catastrophe though I think is it's weird because I don't know how many decks in the format there are that want it, but I think maybe people should be drafting more decks and maybe there could be a deck that exists that wants it that really hasn't been drafted as much yet, like a more like flash speed deck. But I mean, like obviously, like Grow from its Inspiration is instant speed. There are some decent instant speed cards in Delirium. I just think that lots of times you want to be playing to the board more because you get more of an advantage that way. But obviously, it's an instant that puts itself into your graveyard. I mean, all the instants put themselves into your graveyard, so which gives you another type. So, I mean, I can see it to increase your type diversity. Haunting Lullaby is really good. Like, I mean, it's just removal that also is an enchantment for Delirium purposes. You pick that up so quick. Change Perspectives is just sort of a filler. You play it in Delirium, as a curve filler if you don't have anything else as a draw spell. Um, Blueprints is kind of bad. You It goes in the same deck as the Prevent Catastrophe deck, as like the Flash Speed Delirium deck, but I don't think that, again, I don't know how good that is compared to just like the Sorcery Speed Delirium deck. And the reason I say it's for the Delirium deck is because it's an artifact that sacrifices itself, but it is pretty expensive to do so. Gobsmack is really good. I think it's honestly the three or more artifacts or enchantments is a little bit of a trap because I think this is actually best in like uh, Jeskai artifacts and not Delirium. Even though I pick it in Delirium because it's still pretty fine there, but really you want to be playing this in just like I'm going to swarm the board with artifact tokens and then just tempo you out of the game. Which maybe that's also where Prevent Catastrophe should see play in sort of like a Jeskai artifacts tempo shell. Might be an interesting side strategy to look at. Rousing Read is decent. It does the thing. It gives you card advantage and it gives you an aura for Delirium. Distracting Song I think is honestly underpicked. It is not as good as Haunting Lullaby, but again I think it's more tempo efficient, which sometimes matters a lot more. Aspiring Performer is essentially the black equivalent to Enraptured Watcher, but Enraptured Watcher is better because it makes a body for free and also the body has lifelink. So again, you play this if you really need one drop exploit cards. Highbrow Critic is one of the best commons, which might seem weird, but ignore the mill two cards. You're playing this as a as a hard to trade slash kill lifelinker for 2, because what that means is you can just attack with this every turn. Your opponent probably is going to have difficulty like profitably chumping or killing it because of 3 toughness, and then you just get a prepare trigger every turn for free. It's one I prioritize this off over lots of uncommons for that reason, because in prepare it's just nuts because you can have lots of insane curves with this where you don't have to invest additional mana on a turn when you want to play a prepare card. Overdramatic Baritone, again, pretty decent in prepare decks because of the drain one. This really functions as one of the glue pieces for the Esper Blink side deck because of the Grave effect. But yeah, I think this is mostly decent curve filler that you want to prioritize if you're an Esper Blink. Avian Auteur, I mean, it can be a 3-2. It's a Windrake that can be a 3-2 flyer if you're in Delirium. Like, it's just a curve filler. Fiendish Fromagère, another curve filler, but I think it's honestly pretty good because I think a 3-3 Menace is pretty decent stats on board, and it making you a food on top of that, non-negligible. Artistic Benefactor, I mean, it's just really good in exploit. Not much else to say. Like, getting back your cheap creatures so you can exploit them one more time. And hey, what better to curve it into than Motivation Sapper, which is just, hey, I'm a 3-power flyer that also kills one of your opponent's creatures. Motivation Sapper is honestly one of the commons that I could see picking over uncommons as a first pick. It's like, I think people tend to overestimate how well its numbers will perform in practice, because there are definitely lots of boards where it's not as good as it looks, but like, I mean, lots of times it's just gonna function exactly as it looks. Gustatory Explorateur I think is genuinely unplayable, and let me explain. Like, a 5/5 menace that also drains your opponent is also really good, and we talked earlier about how 6-drops are actually playable in this format. However, I think that in the decks that you're in, you can get more impactful 6-drops, or like it. Prepare already has a heavy top end in terms of 5-drops, so you usually don't want to be taxing it even further with Explorateur. And in other decks, you can pick up better uncommon top end usually. Exhausting Rehearsal is just removal. You're usually like, obviously it's the kind of staple thing they've been doing of like hybrid bone splinters / expensive removal thing. Actually, here we have all the removal. Indigestion, pretty good as a kill spell for cheap creatures at instant speed that also can potentially trigger your prepare cards. So you pick this up pretty highly for that reason. Macabre Prop you pick up highly in Delirium decks because you just get to edict away something early, and then you can honestly just like curve right into sacrificing it, or just play a 3-drop and then sacrifice it later, turn on your Delirium. Overworked, I think, is weird because it's quote unquote removal, but honestly, you more want to be using it as a thing to like weaken their creature and then drain them out. I haven't been super impressed by like looking at Overworked, but I'd have to see. Sate the Critics is honestly a card that I think I underpick, and it's honestly because I already usually have lots of sack outlets in the form of exploit creatures themselves. But Sate the Critics is just real good. Like, it's obviously Village Rites is now the going rate for this type of effect, but like allowing you to also sacrifice foods and gaining you 2 life is pretty big game. Um, Casting Call is, I think, a lot better than it looks because of its ability to cheaply put itself into the graveyard for Delirium. So you pick it pretty highly in Delirium decks. Otherwise, not super high on it. Vamp is really good in as like in exploit and prepare because again it gives you lifelink attackers from prepare, but it gives you 2 bodies for exploit. So understudy is just sort of the staple. Uh, when this dies, do the thing. It's not that crazy, but yeah. Stage double is in a weird way an S tier common. It is the exploit common or the exploit card. Um, and it's the reason that you really want your exploit cards to be 3 CMC and under. Um, it just spikes all of your exploit cards so hard. Um, not much to say about it. I think that it's sort of like the mythic common, and maybe I'm hyping up its raw power a lot, but it gives you so much like stability and ability to close out games, and it pulls decks together so well. So that's why it's worth it. Um, Leading Lady is just good as a cheap aggressive creature, especially in exploit where you can trade it in later. Tavern Reveler is also good for similar reasons. Um, Forge Gnome, again, pretty good for similar reasons. Obviously, this is better in artifacts. Merry Troubadour is one of the core pieces of the sideways green-red regale strategy, just because um, it being a 3/3 for 2 with regale means that you can punch through a lot of early boards, and they can't be answered or like traded profitably. Um, and since lots of people aren't in regale, you can honestly pick up like 5 copies of this and just bash someone over the head with it. Extravagant Channeler is one of the good common cards to use with Stage Double. Really good at just being like a cheap tormenting voice on a 3/2 trampler. Iron Street Welders is weird. I think it's not picked that highly because it's a little expensive for what aggressive artifact decks want to be doing, and artifact decks aren't that good either, but it's still quite good. Harbinger of Festivity is honestly one of the better regale cards, and I think is underlooked because of its ability to potentially keep fueling your regale, and its activated ability being pretty cheap. I think that people overlook it because it's a 4-drop with kind of awkward stats, and regale is underplayed, but I think more people should be paying attention to Harbinger of Festivity. Bardic Historian, just really good. Like, I mean, it is just an Archaeomancer, and being able to get back sagas means that you can get back some real big bombs as well. So, honestly, pretty worth picking early to gamble on getting a saga later. Deafening Duo is just not worth it. Do not play Deafening Duo. Spitfire is really, really, really good. Um, it is. Oh, I'm running out of space on my computer, so let's speed this up really quickly. Spitfire is really good because it's a cheap removal that also is really good for triggering your regale. Fiery Set Piece is just really good, like mid-range removal for red. Play it. Clash of Egos. Again, I think you don't need the green mana for this. It's just a solid fight spell at instant speed. Dramatic Organ is sort of overpicked, but it's really good in token decks. But you really want to be heavily into like white red artifact tokens or exploit tokens. Jaunty Tune is the best cheap Regale enabler. So you pick it up really heavily in Regale, and honestly, you can pick it up early to gamble on getting into Regale. Forge Hammer is weird. I don't even know what decks want Forge Hammer. Like, it's good artifact removal, but like it's sort of almost parasitic where like it's an artifact, so the artifact decks will want it. But if you're in the artifact deck, probably no one else is in the artifact deck. So like, Inspired Melody is like, it's fine as like cheap filler for the aggressive GR deck. Tail Weaving I don't really like that much. It exists, but I don't think it's that good. Tavern Tailsmith, this is another one of the core cards for the green-red Regale deck. Because again, it's a 2/3 trample with Regale online. So you just curve this and Demerit Troubadour into something that gives Regale and just beat people over the head. Chill for Painter is just one of the best cards in the set. 2-mana Dork is just really good because again, like you want two turn 2 plays, and Cheerful Painter as just like a dork that can sometimes be a double dork. Absolutely insane. Green Park Strummer, not that good. It's one of the not as good Regale cards. Cookie Snatcher is like, it's a fine curve filler for Prepare, but I think it honestly has a bit too many hoops to jump through to actually be effective. I think people should be playing better 3-drops. Arboreal Artist is a fine curve filler for Delirium because of the mill on death, but it's honestly hard to sequence it dying on curve unless you're trading really aggressively, so I wouldn't recommend it. Gustatory Tastemaker is a fine curve filler for Prepare, but it spikes in that it is one of the ways to, in one card, trigger Tea Time 2, so I pick it up highly if I'm in Prepare to gamble on grabbing a Tea Time 2 later on. It's also one out for me because Chef of the Hunt used to be my 4-drop of choice for there, but like it's just so expensive and like not as good as some of the other 4-drop options you get, so I don't play this that much once now in Prepare. Inspired Raider is really, really good if you're in Delirium, just a cantripping 5/4 with Word 2. But again, Delirium also is another archetype that has pretty heavy top end, so I would be careful about that. Candied Colossus and Garden Guardian both kind of suck. Candied Colossus more so than Garden Guardian. I don't think I'd ever play Candied Colossus unless I really needed some top end. Garden Guardian is like fine, but you can find better. Belligerence is insane. You play it in basically every green deck. It's obviously better in Delirium, but like it's just good removal. Play it everywhere. Gorge on Snacks is like a decent combat trick, whatever. Bountiful Surplus is like, it's a decent Prepare card, but I think you can find better things to do than like not develop your board. Natural Harmony exists for the green-red Regale deck because it's a cheap 1-drop cantripping, it's a 1-drop cantripping non-creature spell. Template Treats, yeah, it's a sideboard card. Colorful Rendition, it's fine. I don't think you like ever play this though. Actually, it's fine in Delirium. I just think that in Delirium there's so many things that don't contribute to your board, and Colorful Rendition is sort of the worst of those. Spoiled Broth is the best sideboard card in the format, and honestly, it's very main deckable. Now we're getting into some of the hybrid cards. Parapet Percher as a Windrake that has like relevant upside, pretty decent. I would play this in a bunch of decks. Paper Familiars is really good for Delirium and is just a sort of good curve filler. Footlight Fiend is one of the best decks for Exploit. You pick this every time. Tear Through is like, it looks insane, and that's because it is insane. You pick this in basically any aggressive deck, and this is honestly one of the reasons to get into Green Red Regale is if you pick up incidental copies of Tear Through, you just go ham on it. Pudding Cat is really, really good. Like obviously it's a 3/1 for 1. That's an artifact, so it's good in the aggressive artifact decks, and it also creates a food token, so it's good in Prepare. It's just great card filler for a lot of strategies. Same for Opera House Gossip. Really good in exploit, but again, it's a cantripping 2-drop. Can't ask for much better. Blaze Cuisinier trades up against a lot of things. It gains life. It's just really good in prepare. Lots of things are just so good in prepare. Inspiring Walk is one of the few things that one of the few Delirium cards I would pick that doesn't contribute to the board because of how much it fills your graveyard and how early it does it. Rooftop Rapscallion, I think, is actually kind of sad. I don't think it's like it exists as a curve filler, but I wouldn't play it honestly. Mechanical Racer is really good for the aggressive artifact decks, and I think it's underpicked. Librarian's Assistant is insane as a cheap 2-drop artifact that also allows you to cheaply fill up your graveyard, or like for Delirium, or just like there are probably better individual 2-drops for specific archetypes, but I mean, if you need curve filling on the low end, this is your guy. Cartographer's Eyes exists. You probably want something better than it. Gnome Stack is good in lots of archetypes, but I think that it's specifically really good in what do you call it, in exploit, because the bodies are so much more relevant there, and you can play this, sack it, and then just have so much exploit fodder. Also pretty good, obviously, in like artifact aggro decks, but it's a lot easier to proactively trigger the whole dying bit and exploit. Rancid Meal is fine in prepare. You don't really play it anywhere else. Prophetic Prism, I honestly am in a spot where despite this being a format where I think I would, and like Prophetic Prism normally being like a pretty decent card, I just feel like you can get fixing elsewhere, and you want to be playing to the board a little bit more, or not even just playing to the board, but playing towards your archetype's win con a little bit harder. But like, it's fine. It exists. I think that there are a lot of decks there are a lot of decks in this format that I think would get better if they didn't play Prophetic Prism as much as they are drafted now. But obviously, it's still a decent card. Fencer's Foil. Yeah, I think that this is honestly underpicked. It's a pretty decent aggro equipment. And yeah, I think that I think honestly it is just underpicked. It should be played more, and I think people need to be playing aggressive decks more to really punish some of the strengths of the value piles that exist. And then we just have the quote unquote temple land cycle. But yeah, that is Merveaux. So overall, that is my impression of every single card in the set. Hopefully, if Matt, you're listening to this is useful to you. And if you're someone who enjoys the set like I do, hopefully this gives you a better understanding of how I see the draft format, and hopefully it helps you draft it as well. If you disagree or have a different philosophy on how to draft the set and how effective some of the cards are, feel free to leave a comment or talk to me about it. Otherwise, this is going to be Caillou signing off.